My name is Farah Allison. I'm 32 years old, and I never imagined the biggest threat to everything I had worked for would come from a conversation I was never supposed to hear. 3 days before my father tried to tie my future to my brother's business loan, I stood outside his home office with a stack of misplaced mail in my hands. Through the half-open door, I heard him calmly assuring my younger brother Colin that I would guarantee the loan. He spoke with complete confidence, as if my agreement had already been given. He listed my savings, my retirement accounts, and my successful accounting practice as though they were family property instead of the result of years of hard work. I didn't interrupt them. I quietly walked back to my car because I already knew arguing would only make me the unreasonable one. My family had always depended on me being responsible while excusing Colin's endless business failures as part of his journey. I had spent 11 years building a respected accounting firm from the ground up, working long nights to pass my CPA exams while Colin chased one dream after another. Every dollar I earned came from discipline, but in my parents' eyes, that only made me the safest person to lean on whenever things went wrong. That evening I sat at my kitchen table, opened my laptop, and called my attorney. Instead of waiting for someone else to decide my future, I decided to protect it. We began transferring my major assets into an irrevocable trust so they could never be offered as collateral without my knowledge. It wasn't done out of anger. It was done because I refused to let guilt make financial decisions for me. A few days later, the bank contacted me to verify information for Colin's loan. That was when I discovered my father had already sent them my old financial statements without asking for permission. I forwarded everything to my attorney and kept careful records of every phone call, email, and message. When the verification meeting finally arrived, I simply told the truth. I had never agreed to guarantee the loan, and the assets they expected to rely on were no longer available. The approval process stopped immediately. Walking out of that bank was one of the hardest things I have ever done, but it also gave me something I had never truly owned before: clear boundaries. My father finally realized that believing I would always rescue everyone was never the same as having my consent. Sometimes protecting your future doesn't require raising your voice. Sometimes it only takes one quiet decision that no one else can undo. I became a CPA 11 years ago, and today I own a small consulting firm in Columbus, Ohio. It isn't a huge company, but it's mine. I have 3 employees, loyal clients, and a business that grew little by little through patience instead of luck. Nothing was handed to me. I worked late nights at a tax preparation office while studying for my CPA exams during the day. There were weekends when I barely slept because I knew every test I passed brought me one step closer to the life I wanted. It was exhausting, but every sacrifice eventually paid off. While I was building my career, my younger brother Colin was still trying to figure out what he wanted. My parents never rushed him. They believed he only needed the right opportunity. His first business was a food truck that lasted less than a year. After that came a marketing agency that closed before it ever became profitable. Each time things fell apart, my parents stepped in with financial help and endless encouragement. They never called those failures mistakes. They called them valuable lessons and reminded everyone that success sometimes takes time. No one looked at my steady career with the same excitement. My achievements weren't celebrated because they had become normal. Every promotion, every new client, and every financial milestone was treated as something that was simply expected from me. I wasn't the exciting child with big dreams. I was the dependable daughter who always handled her responsibilities without complaint. Over the years, that role quietly became part of my identity. I don't believe my parents loved Colin more than me. Looking back, I think they honestly believed they were helping him while trusting me to take care of myself. My father had spent decades as a high school teacher, and he always believed families should support one another through difficult times. My mother rarely questioned his decisions. She had a way of softening his words until they sounded caring, even when they placed an unfair burden on someone else. The problem wasn't love. It was expectation. Every time Colin needed another chance, everyone naturally looked in my direction. I was the stable one with savings, a successful business, and a predictable life. Without anyone saying it out loud, my hard work slowly became something the family counted on. I wasn't just expected to succeed anymore. I was expected to use that success to solve problems I hadn't created, and after years of accepting that role, everyone assumed I always would. A few weeks later, Colin told us he was starting another business. This time it was a small brewery, and unlike his previous ideas, he had a detailed business plan and a bank that seemed interested in financing it. I was genuinely happy for him. I knew how much he wanted something that would finally succeed, and I hoped this would be the opportunity that changed everything. At that point, I had no reason to believe his project would have anything to do with me. One Sunday afternoon in July, I stopped by my parents' house to drop off several letters that had accidentally been delivered to my address. I walked in through the side entrance like I had done countless times before. As I reached the hallway, I noticed my father's home office door was slightly open. I wasn't trying to listen, but I heard Colin asking what would happen if the bank refused to approve the loan. Before I could walk away, my father answered with complete confidence. He told Colin not to worry because I would guarantee the loan if the bank needed stronger financial backing. He spoke as though the decision had already been made. He even mentioned my accounting practice, my retirement savings, and the financial stability I had spent years creating. Then he said he would provide my information to the bank so everything could move forward without delays. I froze where I was standing. The stack of mail in my hands suddenly felt much heavier. It wasn't just the words themselves that shocked me. It was how natural they sounded. My father wasn't asking for my opinion or wondering whether I might agree. He had already included me in the plan without speaking to me first. As an accountant, I immediately understood what becoming a guarantor would mean. If Colin's business failed, the lender could look to my personal assets for repayment. Everything I had built through years of hard work could be placed at risk for a business I didn't own and couldn't manage. It wasn't a small favor. It was a major financial responsibility that could affect my future for years. For a moment, I considered opening the door and confronting them. But deep down, I knew exactly how that conversation would end. My concerns would be dismissed as overthinking, and I would be told that family members help each other without asking questions. I had experienced that pattern too many times before. Instead, I quietly placed the mail on a nearby table and slipped back outside without making a sound. By the time I reached my car, my decision was already taking shape. I wasn't planning an argument or preparing a dramatic speech. I was thinking about how to protect everything I had spent more than a decade building. For the first time, I understood that staying silent didn't always mean giving in. Sometimes it meant giving yourself enough time to make the right move. When I got home a little after 9 that evening, I expected to feel angry or heartbroken. Instead, I felt unusually calm. Maybe it was because hearing my father's plan had answered questions I had been asking myself for years. I wasn't imagining the pattern anymore. I had finally seen it with my own eyes. Rather than calling a friend or sitting alone with my thoughts, I made a cup of coffee, opened my laptop, and treated the situation the same way I would handle a serious issue for one of my clients. The first call I made was to my attorney. In more than a decade of running my business, I had almost never needed her after hours, and certainly never for a personal matter. I explained everything from the beginning, including what I had overheard outside my father's office and why I believed my finances were already being discussed without my permission. She listened carefully before giving me advice that immediately changed the way I looked at the situation. She told me that waiting to see what happened would be a mistake. Even if no documents had been signed yet, people already believed my assets were available. That assumption alone could create problems. She reminded me that financial boundaries should be protected before someone crosses them, not afterward. Her words were simple, but they stayed with me. If I wanted complete control over my future, I needed to act immediately instead of hoping my family would eventually respect my decision. Within an hour we had a clear plan. My savings, retirement accounts, and the money I had been setting aside to buy my own office building would be transferred into an irrevocable trust. Once the process was complete, those assets could no longer be casually offered as security for anyone else's loan. It wasn't a decision I made lightly. I understood that creating the trust also meant limiting my own access, but that was exactly why it would work. I knew myself well enough to recognize that guilt could eventually wear me down if nothing stood between my emotions and my finances. Before midnight, the first legal documents had already been prepared. I reviewed every page carefully, signed them electronically, and sent everything back to my attorney. The transfers would take several business days, but the process had officially begun. For the first time since leaving my parents' house that afternoon, I felt completely in control. I closed my laptop, looked around my quiet kitchen, and realized I wasn't protecting money alone. I was protecting years of sacrifice, discipline, and independence. That night, I slept peacefully because I knew my future would no longer depend on someone else's promises. About 10 days after I overheard my father talking to Colin, something happened that confirmed my worst fear. My assistant transferred a phone call to my office, believing it was related to my own business. Instead, a friendly loan officer introduced herself and thanked me for taking the time to discuss the guarantee for Colin's brewery loan. For a second, I thought she had the wrong person. Then she casually explained that the bank only needed to verify a few financial details before moving forward with the approval. I didn't interrupt her. I simply listened until she finished. Every sentence made it clearer that the bank already believed I had agreed to support the loan. They spoke as though I was completing the final step of a process that had already been settled. Keeping my voice calm, I asked if she could email me every document they had connected to my name before we scheduled any meeting. She agreed without hesitation. A few minutes later, the email arrived. I opened the attachments expecting to find basic paperwork. Instead, I found copies of financial statements I had shared with my father 2 years earlier when my accounting practice celebrated its first profitable year. At the time, I had been proud of what I had accomplished. I wanted my parents to see that every late night, every difficult exam, and every sacrifice had been worth it. I never imagined those documents would leave our family files. The email also contained a short message written by my father. He told the bank that I was financially strong enough to guarantee the loan and suggested they contact him if they needed anything else. Reading those words felt worse than hearing the conversation outside his office. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a hopeful assumption anymore. He had already presented my finances to strangers without my permission, convinced that I would eventually agree. I didn't react emotionally. Years of working as an accountant had taught me that important decisions should never be made in anger. I carefully saved every attachment, every email, and every detail exactly as I received them. Then I forwarded the complete conversation to my attorney with a short note asking her to review everything before I responded to the bank. I ignored the urge to defend myself immediately. There would be time for that later. At that moment, the smartest decision was to slow everything down and let the facts speak for themselves. The documents told a clear story. My financial information had been shared without my knowledge, and my consent had been assumed instead of requested. From that point forward, every step I took would be based on evidence, not emotion, because I knew the truth would matter far more than the loudest voice. A few days after the trust documents were signed, I decided it was time to tell my parents. I didn't want them hearing about it from anyone else, and I wasn't interested in turning it into a dramatic confrontation. I called my father on a Thursday afternoon and calmly explained that my financial assets had been placed into an irrevocable trust. Then I told him something I had probably needed to say years earlier. My money, my savings, and my financial records were not available for anyone else to discuss or promise on my behalf. If someone wanted my help, they could ask me directly. The answer would always begin with a conversation, not an assumption. For a few seconds there was complete silence. Then my father's voice became colder than I had ever heard it. He insisted that this wasn't about money. According to him, families support each other without keeping score, and I was making a simple situation unnecessarily complicated. I answered as calmly as I could. I told him that helping family should always be a choice, never an expectation. Respect starts with asking, not deciding for someone else. That conversation ended quickly, but the pressure didn't. My mother called the following morning. She didn't yell or accuse me outright. Instead, she sounded disappointed, telling me that Colin's future depended on this opportunity and that I was putting financial security ahead of family. She reminded me of stories about relatives who had sacrificed for one another, hoping guilt would change my mind. I listened without arguing because I knew we weren't talking about the same issue. She believed this was about generosity. I knew it was about consent. Later that day, Colin called. Unlike my parents, he sounded genuinely confused. He explained that the bank had delayed the loan because they still needed confirmation from the guarantor. Then he asked what I had done to stop everything. I answered honestly. I hadn't stopped anything. I had simply refused to agree to something I had never been asked about in the first place. There was a long pause before he quietly admitted that Dad had already told him everything was settled. He said our father was certain I would never object because I had always helped before. Hearing that hurt more than any accusation my parents could have made. It showed me that my willingness to be dependable had slowly turned into something everyone believed they owned. My reliability had become an unwritten promise that no one thought needed my permission anymore. That phone call made one thing clear. I wasn't breaking a family tradition. I was finally ending an unhealthy expectation that had followed me for years. After the conversations with my parents and Colin, I realized something important. No matter how carefully I explained my reasons, the story was already beginning to change. People weren't discussing whether my permission had been ignored. They were talking about whether I had been selfish. That was when I stopped trying to convince anyone. My job wasn't to win an emotional debate. My job was to protect the facts. Years of working as an accountant had taught me that memories can be unreliable, but documents rarely are. I created a folder on my computer and saved every email connected to the loan. I backed up every voicemail and screenshot of every text message. Then I wrote a detailed timeline starting from the afternoon I overheard my father speaking to Colin outside his home office. I recorded dates, conversations, and exactly what had happened, leaving out opinions and sticking only to information I could support. The phone calls from relatives kept coming. My aunt told me I had become too focused on money and reminded me that family should always come first. I thanked her for her concern but refused to argue. A disagreement was exactly what everyone expected from me, and I wasn't willing to give them one. My mother sent several long messages explaining how previous generations had always helped one another without hesitation. Reading them made me sad because they completely ignored the real issue. No one had asked whether I wanted to help. They had simply decided that I would. I also heard through relatives that some people believed I had intentionally ruined Colin's opportunity because I couldn't stand seeing him succeed. That accusation almost made me laugh. I had encouraged every one of his business ideas and genuinely wanted him to do well. I simply refused to risk everything I had built for a business I didn't own and couldn't control. There was a huge difference between supporting someone and being volunteered on their behalf. The trust documents remained neatly organized in a folder beside the printed email my father had sent to the bank with my financial statements attached. I looked at those papers several times but I never shared them with anyone. I wasn't interested in embarrassing my father or proving him wrong in front of the family. I kept them because evidence matters when emotions begin changing the story. Eventually there would be a time to explain exactly what had happened, and when that moment arrived I wanted every detail to be accurate. Truth doesn't become stronger by being louder. It becomes stronger by being clear, complete, and impossible to deny. The bank rescheduled the verification meeting for the following Tuesday morning. My father described it as a chance to clear up a simple misunderstanding, but I knew it was much more than that. I agreed to attend on one condition. I wanted to meet with the bank representatives alone before speaking to anyone from my family. This wasn't a private family disagreement anymore. It involved my financial information, my legal rights, and decisions that had been made without my permission. When I arrived, the loan officer introduced himself as Greg. He was polite, professional, and completely unaware of the situation behind the paperwork sitting on his desk. A compliance associate joined us, opened the loan file, and explained that they only needed to verify my current financial position before final approval could be issued. From their point of view, everything seemed routine. They believed I was simply confirming information that had already been provided. Instead of discussing numbers, I asked one question. Can you show me where I gave written permission to become the guarantor for this loan? Greg immediately searched through the documents. He opened emails, scanned forms, and checked every page attached to the application. After several quiet moments, he looked back at me and admitted there was no signed consent from me anywhere in the file. The only supporting information was an email from my father along with financial statements that were already 2 years old. I calmly explained that I had never agreed to guarantee Colin's loan. I also informed them that the financial records they were reviewing no longer reflected my current situation. 2 weeks earlier, my major assets had been transferred into an irrevocable trust through my attorney. Those funds were no longer held in my personal name and could not be offered as collateral for anyone else's borrowing. Even if I suddenly changed my mind, I no longer had the legal authority to pledge those assets. The room became very quiet. No one argued with me because there was nothing to argue about. The paperwork spoke for itself. Greg reviewed the file one final time before explaining that the loan could not continue under its current structure. Without a qualified guarantor who had knowingly agreed to accept the legal responsibility, the application could not be approved. I thanked both bank employees for their professionalism and gathered my documents. Walking out of that meeting, I didn't feel victorious. I felt relieved. For the first time since overhearing my father outside his home office, the truth existed somewhere beyond family opinions. It was written in an official file, supported by facts instead of assumptions. No one could honestly claim that I had broken a promise because the bank had confirmed what I already knew. I had never made one. I thought the meeting was over, but about 15 minutes later the conference room door opened. My father walked in looking completely relaxed, as though he had arrived to finish paperwork instead of resolve a serious problem. He greeted Greg with a friendly smile and immediately started explaining that there had been a misunderstanding. According to him, I was simply being extra careful and everything would be sorted out within a few minutes. He even laughed lightly before saying my financial position hadn't really changed and that the documents already on file were close enough to what I currently owned. I stayed quiet while he spoke. For years I had interrupted conversations like this, trying to defend myself before anyone reached the wrong conclusion. It never helped. This time I waited until he finished because the facts were already sitting on the table. There was nothing left to argue about. When the room became silent, I looked at Greg instead of my father. I explained that I had never given permission for my financial records to be shared with the bank or used to support someone else's loan application. I also confirmed that the statements they had received no longer reflected my current financial position. My assets had already been transferred into an irrevocable trust, making them unavailable as personal collateral. The decision had been made legally, properly, and with professional advice. No one interrupted me. Greg simply nodded as he reviewed the updated information already recorded in the file. The compliance associate remained focused on the documents in front of her. Everything I said matched the paperwork they had already examined. For the first time since the situation began, my father had no answer ready. His confidence disappeared almost instantly. He wasn't shouting or arguing. He simply stared at me with an expression I had never seen before. It looked like someone had removed the ground beneath his feet. I think that was the exact moment he realized the decision was final. There would be no emotional conversation capable of changing legal documents that had already been completed. He quietly said my name, almost as if he expected me to soften or reassure him. I didn't respond because there was nothing left to explain. I had already answered every important question. I gathered my folder, thanked Greg and the compliance associate for their professionalism and stood up to leave. As I walked toward the door, I wasn't trying to embarrass my father. I simply understood that my part in the meeting was finished. Behind me remained a loan application without a guarantor and a father who had finally learned that confidence could never replace consent. Some lessons arrive through long conversations. Others arrive in complete silence, when the paperwork leaves no room for anyone else's assumptions. Life didn't suddenly return to normal after the bank meeting. In many ways, it simply became quieter. A few months later, Collins Brewery finally received approval for a smaller loan. This time the financing was built on his own resources instead of mine. He contributed his personal savings, and one of his business partners agreed to become the co-signer because he was directly involved in the company. It wasn't the large amount they had originally hoped for, but it was enough to get started. I honestly believed that was healthier for everyone. If the business succeeded, the people taking the risk would also enjoy the reward. If it struggled, the responsibility would remain with those who made the decisions. Colin and I don't speak as often as we once did, but when we do, our conversations are respectful. I think he eventually realized that I wasn't trying to stop his dream. I simply refused to finance it without being asked. There is a big difference between supporting someone and having your future volunteered on their behalf. Things with my parents changed even more. My father and I still speak, but our relationship has become more careful. We avoid pretending nothing happened because we both know it did. He has never apologized for sending my financial information to the bank or assuming he could offer my assets without permission. I used to wait for that apology, but eventually I stopped expecting it. Some people admit they were wrong with words. Others simply become quieter because they understand they crossed a line. My mother still believes I reacted too strongly, although she no longer says it directly to me. Instead of continuing the same arguments, I wrote both of my parents a letter. It wasn't written to blame them or reopen old wounds. I explained exactly why I created the trust, why consent mattered, and why protecting my financial independence wasn't an act of selfishness. Once I sent it, I felt no need to explain myself again. Looking back, I wish things had unfolded differently. I wish my father had trusted me enough to ask instead of deciding for me. I wish our family had been able to solve the problem around a dinner table instead of inside a bank conference room. But I don't regret the decision I made. The trust still exists today, quietly doing exactly what it was designed to do. My business continues to grow, my savings remain protected, and my future belongs to me. In the end, I didn't lose my family. I simply changed the rules of how we treat one another. That may not have repaired every relationship, but it gave me something I had never fully possessed before. Peace built on clear boundaries instead of silent expectations. If there's one lesson this experience left me with, it's that being dependable should never mean giving up the right to make your own choices. Many responsible people slowly become the family's safety net without even realizing it. They work hard, save carefully, pay their bills on time, and quietly build stable lives. Over time, everyone around them begins to assume those achievements are available whenever someone else needs help. That's where the line starts to disappear. For years, I believed saying yes made me a good daughter and a good sister. I thought carrying more responsibility was simply part of loving the people closest to me. What I failed to understand was that real support only has value when it is offered freely. The moment someone decides for you, generosity becomes obligation, and kindness turns into expectation. The sentence I overheard outside my father's home office changed the way I see responsibility forever. He wasn't trying to insult me. In his mind, he was expressing confidence in everything I had accomplished. But confidence without permission can still cause harm. My years of discipline, careful planning, and financial security had quietly become part of someone else's solution before I even knew there was a problem to solve. I never raised my voice. I never threatened anyone or demanded an apology. Instead, I protected what I had built through legal steps, clear boundaries, and calm decisions. Looking back, I'm proud of that. Anger may have won me a loud argument, but patience protected my future. Today my life is peaceful. My business continues to grow, my finances remain secure, and every major decision involving my money begins with one person: me. That simple change has brought me more confidence than I expected. It reminded me that saying no isn't an act of betrayal when the request was never honestly made in the first place. If you've spent your life being the reliable one, remember this: your success belongs to you. Your savings are not a family emergency fund simply because you managed your life responsibly. Helping the people you love is a wonderful choice, but it must always remain a choice. The night I heard my father promise my future to someone else, I didn't start a fight. I quietly made sure no one could ever make that promise again without my knowledge. Sometimes the strongest boundary isn't built with harsh words. Sometimes it's built with one careful decision that protects everything you've worked so hard to create.